Family is central to my faith, and stories of family help feed my faith. And as many of you know, half of my ancestry is Italian. And we have an expression that in Italian households, there are two primary topics of conversation: food and death. I don't know how many of you saw the 1987 film, one of my favorites, Moonstruck, written by John Patrick Shanley. And there are three characters: Rose Castorini, Cosmo Castorini, and Loretta Castorini. And at one point, Loretta and Cosmo, played by Cher and Vince Gardenia, are going to wake up Rose Castorini, played by Olympia Dukakis. And as they're shaking her awake, as soon as her eyes open, the first two words out of her mouth are, "Who's dead?" Death is an active part of our lives, particularly these days when as a nation we are suffering, particularly the deaths of this virus. And for many of us, the death of what was our normal way of life. John's Gospel today brings us face to face with death and resurrection. We encounter Jesus, who brings Lazarus back to life. It's a beautiful scene early in the gospel where Jesus is coming, Lazarus has died, and Martha runs out and says to him, "Lord, if you had been here, this would not have happened." And that perhaps is a sentiment we all have in our hearts when we're suffering. Oh God, if you had been here, this would not have happened. But Jesus enters the scene, enters the tomb, enters the stench, and brings Lazarus back to life. We know that John's gospel is very symbolic, and that this gospel is not just about the raising of Lazarus from the dead, but it points us to Jesus' triumph over sin and death, and Jesus' power to bring all back to life. It's important at this time, as we pray on this passage, that we reflect on death, and particularly the relationship between suffering and death. Like many of you, I have had time to read these days. And one of the texts that I've recently been rereading is C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed. There's also a movie version of it called Shadowlands. And in the book, C.S. Lewis writes about the loss of his wife. He married late in life. He married a woman much younger than he, and she simply wasn't supposed to die before him. And at some point, he feels the freedom to write about the grief he's observing. When he writes about suffering, he uses an adage. He said, "I read a sentence once that I lay awake all night with a toothache and thinking about having a toothache." And he says, that's true to life. Part of every misery is misery's shadow or reflection. The fact that we don't merely suffer, but we keep thinking about the fact that we are suffering. And he says, "I not only live each day in endless grief, but each day thinking about living in endless grief." It's true of suffering. We can find that we're in a spiral or a vortex from which there is no escape. But after reflecting on suffering, he also reflects on how God is present in his life. And he begins by imagining, maybe God's testing me. Maybe this is an experiment to see whether or not I have faith. He said, but God already knows why I have faith. Perhaps it's I who didn't know the depths of my faith. And he writes, in this trial, God, makes us occupy the dock, the witness box, and the bench all at once. He always knew that my temple was a house of cards. This is his only way of making me knock it down and realize it. Perhaps our temple is a house of cards. Perhaps we rely so heavily on all the rhythms and the structures that get us through life that when those die, we wonder, is God testing us? Is this an experiment? Is God abandoning us? But perhaps it's most important now, when our lives are turned upside down, that we realize it is God who will turn them right side up again. That just as God could raise Lazarus from the dead, God can raise us to life from the ashes and the brokenness we're feeling right now. And that God can keep our eyes fixed on Easter, however that celebration will be, trusting that through pandemic, through suffering, through uncertainty, God always brings life from death.